Welcome to Intro to Painting and welcome to your first demo. For this demo, we're going to be making a color wheel. So this is a chance to experiment with mixing paints and kind of the surface that you can get with a paintbrush, creating smooth surfaces, and then also kind of experimenting with the opacity and transparency of paint. So first off, what do you need when you're painting? You need paint, you need a surface to paint on, so I'm going to be doing this on watercolor paper. You need a palette. I really like these disposable palettes because when you're done you just tear it off and fold it up and throw it away. Cleaning up acrylic paint is rough, so this makes it a little bit easier. So a palette to mix paint on. You need a tub of water to clean out your brushes and add water if you want to kind of water down your paints just a little bit. You need some brushes. So for this class I recommended like the white soft brushes. They work really nice and they help you get smooth textures. But there's a variety of brushes you can use, and this is a good chance to experiment with, like, what happens if I use a medium-sized brush? What happens if I use a big brush? What happens if I use sort of a smaller sized brush? What can I get? And then you always need lots of paper towels. So I have paper towels set out here for my brushes, but then I also have some paper towels to be able to wipe off my palette knife, clean up spills. Just having that giant roll next to you is always a good idea. And then I protect my desk with newspaper, and I'm currently wearing a lovely little green painting apron. Actually, it's not little, it's large, because the reality of working with acrylic paints is that almost everything it gets on, it stays on. It's sort of a plasticky based medium. So do be careful about what, it will wash off your hands eventually. Gets on your hands, stays there, maybe maximum a day of scrubbing, usually much less than that. It's pretty easy to scrub off your fingers and hands. Skin is wonderful, but other things like clothes, desk surfaces, it will be permanent on, so you want to avoid that. Okay, I'm gonna put these paints away. Okay, so a color wheel. Color wheel is named because the main colors form a wheel. You have the primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, and they mix to form the secondary colors, orange, purple, and green. And then you can add the different values, the lights and the darks. You can make things lighter and you can make things darker. So this is what we're going to attempt to make. Now, one thing I want you to notice in the paints that I have laid out, I actually have, it looks like I have a lot of paints, but what I have are 2 reds, 2 yellows, 2 blues, a black, white, and then the medium. So this is called a retarder, and it slows the paint dry time down. Get in the habit of mixing that into all your paints. It will make your life so much better. I often have students who don't do that at the beginning, and then about halfway through the class I sort of remind them and they try it out and they're like, this is wonderful, why didn't you tell us about it? I did. Try it out. And then this looks like white paint, but it's actually a transparent glossy medium, so it adds a little bit of gloss to your color, and but it does make your paints just a little bit more transparent. Okay, let's see if we can make room for everything here. So as you look at the colors of the paints, notice that this red is a little more purpley, so this red veers towards purple. This red is a little more orangey, veers towards orange. If I mix them together, I get a nice, like, pure red. But most colors out of the tube veer one way or the other. This yellow is a little bit more orangey. This yellow is a little bit more green. This blue is a little bit more green. That blue is a little bit more purple. So you may not have as many paints as I do and not be able to mix things in the same way, and that's okay. Just do your best. But know that you can always, like if a blue feels a little bit like too green, you could try, like, see if you have another blue that pushes it a little bit more blue, or if you want to push it a little bit more green, like try mixing paints and see what happens. Ultimately, what I want you to come out of this is know that, like, don't be stuck with the colors that come out of the tube. Mix the colors that you want. All right, so I'm going to start with red. Let's start with red. Okay, because it's over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my palette knife, and I'm going to dip in kind of my pans of paint, like the clean areas. And I'm going to just use my palette knife to kind of mix and evaluate as I look at this. This is still looking a little purpley, so I'm going to pull some more kind of orangey red into it. One thing to be aware of when you're mixing paints and laying paints out on your palette is obviously you don't want to waste paint, but you also want to make sure that you're making enough. If I don't mix enough red right now, because I'm going to use this red to add white to and to add black to, so I need enough red for my purposes. So I want to make sure everything, the two different colors are fully mixed together so I don't get a streaky paint. And that looks like a good red. Now I've got red on my palette knife. If I let that dry even like 10 minutes, it's going to be permanently stuck to my palette knife. So I'm going to take a paper towel. You are going to go through a lot of paper towels in this class, and clean it off while it's still dry. Oops, I forgot. I want to mix in that retarder. Mine's a little bit gloopy because it's kind of old, but it should still work. It's just going to take a little bit more mixing. Okay, so some retarder, and I'm going to add some of that gloss medium too, just to see what it kind of does. So I'm going to pull that in. You can see this is an old retarder. I might transition to a newer one in the future, but when it mixes in it well. And what that does is it means that, like, as my paint goes on my canvas, I can move it around a little bit more. It doesn't dry immediately. So again, clean off the palette knife so it doesn't dry on the palette knife. Also, if I'm ever transitioning colors, I don't want to dip a red palette knife into my yellow, because then I'm going to lose the integrity of my yellow and contaminate it. Okay, so that's clean. I'm going to pick my brush. Let's try, I'm just going to use a medium brush, and I dip it in. With brushes, you always want to pull. You never want to push. Always pull. And you'll notice I've loaded about half of the brush. It just makes it really hard to clean the brush if you pile the paint all the way up into this area. So just kind of keep it on the ends of the bristles. And then keep moving my color wheel out of the way. So I'm gonna do circles, but you can do whatever shape you want. And I'm gonna try to make a pretty smooth circle. So the goal of this is to make your edges clean. You'll see how in some areas they're kind of ragged, and to make your circle smooth. So I'm going to kind of just keep painting it so that the paint doesn't feel bumpy and that my edge is smooth. Now, if it looks like it's a little bit transparent, that's because I added some transparent things to it, but also, like, if I were using yellow, yellow is a little more transparent than red and blue. And so the ultimate solution is add another layer. So I would wait for this layer of red to dry, and then I would add another layer of red over the top of that, and that's going to make it look smoother. So now I'm going to, again, don't let your brush dry, clean it out. And while I have this red mixed up, I'm going to mix my values, my light tint and my dark shade. So get my palette knife, and I'm going to use the red that I've already mixed up, and I'm going to add some white. Now see, I mixed in, I was careful, but I still mixed in some red with that white, so it's something you want to be cautious of. So there's, and if I want a lighter tint, I just mix in more white. If I want a darker tint, I just mix in more red. For the purposes of the color wheel, that looks good. It's different enough. And then I'm going to clean off my palette knife, and then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to grab a little bit more red in a separate area, and then a tiny bit of black. Now black is strong, so sometimes you'll notice I grabbed a lot more white to get that tint than I grabbed black to get this shade. Black is a very strong pigment. Okay, and then clean off palette knife. And then for this, I want to do smaller ones, so I'm going to use a smaller brush. Use your brushes accordingly to smaller. So I'll do just a nice little small circle. Again, I'm going for clean edges and a smooth surface. Work that paint around. Okay, and then because I'm transitioning colors, I want to clean my brush off. So I dip it in the water and I go all the way down to the bottom and kind of scrub it, and then I go onto my paper towel and I dab things off. I'll move these mediums out of the way, and that way I can make sure it's clean. Let's try the shade. If I need more, just grab a little more paint. If it feels like too thick and gunky, the mediums can help, but you can also add a little bit of water and it thins it down. However, you don't want to add too much because then it makes it feel like watercolor. So you'll notice, so here's just a scrap piece of paper. I always recommend having some sort of scrap piece of paper to test colors out, to test things out. So if it spreads a lot farther and a lot kind of easier. It just feels less gunky when I have some water, but it also feels thinner and more like it soaks in to the page, as opposed to acrylic is meant to kind of lie on top and be thick. But sometimes like a little bit of water really does help, so feel free to mix in some water. Okay, clean that off real good, double check on the paper towel. That's great. Another reason you want to put stuff, clean it off on the paper towel is you don't want excess water. You always want to control the amount of water you're using with your paints. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing with the yellow and the blue. I'm going to mix the color and then mix the value and the tint. All right, so this is an old yellow and it has already dried up on me. So I'm going to find a better yellow to use. If it's dried up, it's really not worth using. And you'll notice I accidentally had a tiny bit of red in there. So I'm going to mix it and see if that makes a difference. If it makes a difference, I might just need to abandon this yellow and then go for a new one. But that's looking okay. Tiny bit of contamination is currently looking okay. So while I'm mixing, I'm just going to go ahead and mix the tint in the shade. Oops, I forgot my mediums. So clean this off. I'm going to grab some retarder and some gloss. Okay, so I've got red, yellow, and blue and their relative values and tints. One thing you'll notice, the red is a little bit streaky. So again, the way I get rid of that is I let it dry completely and then I do another layer over the top. If you don't let it dry, what's gonna happen is you're gonna pick up the paint underneath and kind of like you do with a whiteboard marker when you're trying to color and it like erases part of it, but then adds part of it while you're doing it. So the best thing is to make sure it dries completely. Now I have a tiny spot that's not dry, but I'm gonna risk it. But if this was a painting I cared about, I would 100% make sure I let that dry. So you can see that second layer, and sometimes you even need a third layer. It like just really seals the deal on making it feel smooth and less streaky and 100% covered and opaque. You might have noticed when I was doing the values on the shades of the yellow and the blue that I forgot to take out the excess water. So those got a little bit watery, which means they both need a little bit of, they need another layer too. So I'm gonna do the yellow layer. And you can see how much more, again, it just becomes more opaque, more smooth, less streaky. And one thing you want to be aware of is if you have excess water up here, if it drips down, that can mess up the water on your brush too, so you want to be careful of that. Okay. All right, now you'll notice my water is pretty gross, so I'm going to go change that out. Dirty water wouldn't matter so much if I'm working with darker colors, but with a lighter color, it could start to affect both the value and the color. Now I'm running out of space on my palette, so I'm going to get a new palette for mixing our secondary colors, but I still need this one accessible because I need to pull from the primary colors. Okay, you can just rip another sheet off. You don't have to have two pads. All right, so get my palette knife. Now one thing, so you want to be aware of, like I said before, if your colors lean, here, make sure you can see this. If your colors lean red or green, but you also want to be aware of blue is dark, yellow is light, red is sort of medium. So when I'm mixing an orange, let's start with orange, I'm going to need more yellow and slightly less red, and I'm going to use the ones that both already lean towards orange. Okay, that's starting to feel like a nice orange. I'm going to add my mediums. So remember how in class we talked about how acrylic paint is made of pigment and medium. So a tube of acrylic paint has a certain amount of pigment and then just basically what's called acrylic medium. And then these are both considered acrylic mediums, but they're acrylic mediums with different properties. So you can get a variety of acrylic mediums with all sorts of properties, and they, yeah, that it helps you control the paint and what the paint is doing a lot more by mixing in the mediums. So most artists, they oil paints the same way. They don't just paint straight out of a tube. They're mixing colors, they're mixing mediums. They're controlling the paint in a variety of ways. Okay, so you notice when I mixed the orange, I used a lot more yellow than I did red. So green is going to be extreme in how much yellow versus blue I use. Purple is going to be a little bit different. It's all about adding the amount until you get the color you want. So I'm going to paint my oranges in, and then I'm going to mix up the green and the purple, and then we'll see where we're at. Okay, so this orange is super thick. So if I were to keep painting with this, I'd probably add a tiny bit of water to thin it out just a little bit and make it easier to work with. Because you really want to avoid creating a bumpy surface when you're working in layers. That just, it does weird things with lighting. It makes it harder to paint layers over the top. You really always want to keep your paint on the thinner side and keep it smooth. Oops, I wasn't paying attention. I accidentally put the dark ones and the light ones in opposites. Doesn't matter for this because this is play. If I were doing a real painting, that could start to matter and I would need to pay more attention. So you can see I mixed in some water with that green because it was chunky like the orange. So that made it a lot easier to smooth around than the orange, but it's also much more transparent and hence streaky. So then I would need to come back in and cover it. So there's always a little bit of a give and take with the water. So you notice for the purple, I tried a different brush. If you have a couple different brushes, like try them out, see what happens. And there we go, my color wheel. If I want to make it look extra nice, I'm probably going to do another layer of blue, green, and purple. Again, when they dry. My blue is dry, so let's try that out. I got a big chunk of paint on my paintbrush, which is actually not ideal. But if I'm careful in spreading it around, I can make it work. There we go, that looks better. Of course, more paint also equals darker. That green also looks pretty dry, so I'm going to go in with another layer. There. I'm kind of messing up my edges, so normally I'd want to slow down and pay attention to those because edges really matter. And then my purple has dried quickly as well, so let's go and just kind of make things look nice. Purple is very transparent, which means it might need 3 layers to really look good, but already that second layer just adds a lot. Makes it smoother, less streaky. Looks good. Okay, so I made a color wheel. We compare the two. Obviously printed colors are going to look a little bit different than painted colors, and that's okay. That dot in the middle is what happens if you mix all the paints and you essentially get like a blackish brown. So feel free to try that out. If you've gotten this far and want to just keep experimenting with mixing colors and trying out different things, feel free to do that. I don't care if this looks perfect, like this is play. I just want to be able to see that you've tried out mixing the different colors and trying to make it smooth, trying to make your edges clean as much as possible. So again, it's exercise. It's an exercise. Just play, have fun, experiment with how the paint works, and enjoy it.